I was hosting a dinner at my house with my husband's family. Everything was going fairly normally until my father-in-law, John, took my plate and told me I had to eat after the men in the family. I felt insulted and immediately wanted to push back, but Thomas, my husband, just shook his head and said it was a family tradition. That feeling made me furious, but I tried to stay calm. Thomas and I have been married for 3 years. Our relationship isn't bad, but over time I've started to realize that his family has outdated values and traditions I simply can't fit into. Thomas's family is a completely different world from what I've known. My father-in-law, John, is very conservative and controlling, always wanting everything in the household to go his way. He's tall, speaks in a deep, commanding voice, and always believes he's the center of attention. He likes to take jabs at me with comments like, "You look strong. I bet you're good at cooking," as if assigning me a role as servant. My mother-in-law, Susan, is always silent and never engages in any argument. Even when she knows I'm being treated unfairly, she says nothing. Luke, Thomas's older brother, is like a magnified version of their father, loud, arrogant, and sees women as decorative objects. He once scoffed at me when he saw me reading a book. Rachel, Luke's wife, always looks tense as if she's afraid of being criticized, never daring to speak her mind. Looking back at my own family, I realize how lucky I was. My father often washed the dishes after dinner so my mother could rest, and my mother never hesitated to argue with him when she disagreed. They taught me that marriage is about walking together, not one leading and the other following. But Thomas's family is different. They live as if time stopped in the last century, where men sit on thrones and women wait at their feet. That difference isn't just a gap, it's an abyss. I started to feel suffocated, as if every time I stepped into their house, I had to shed my own skin to fit into a mold they'd already cast. I tried, truly, tried to smile, tried to stay quiet, tried to blend in. But the longer I lived in that environment, the more I felt crushed. On a typical day, I had prepared an elaborate dinner for the family. I started early in the morning, picking out the smoothest potatoes, marinating chicken with fragrant herbs, and baking bread until the crust was perfectly golden. I set the table with care, cream-colored tablecloth, small candles casting a soft glow, and light jazz playing from an old speaker in the corner of the room. I stood and admired my work before everyone arrived, silently hoping that maybe this time they'd see me not just as Thomas's wife, but as a woman who loves and builds. But that peaceful atmosphere didn't last long. When everyone arrived, everything started as usual. John slapped Thomas on the back and laughed. "Son, you really picked well. This food smells amazing." Susan nodded at me quietly, while Luke threw his coat onto the sofa like it was his own house. Rachel followed behind, her eyes anxiously darting to her husband, as if waiting for instructions. I brought out each dish, smiling and inviting everyone to sit, and once everyone was settled, I placed my own plate last, right in front of my seat. I was just about to pull out my chair when John suddenly stood up, his hand lightening fast as he snatched my plate and handed it straight to Luke. "Today, you eat after the men. That's the tradition in this house," he said, his voice steady but cold, as if it were an unquestionable fact. The whole room fell silent, a heavy, suffocating silence, like the air had been sucked out. I stood frozen, my hand loosely gripping the edge of the chair, my mind spinning. Luke started eating immediately, without even looking up, as if the plate had always been his. Susan bowed her head, her hands trembling as they clenched the napkin, not daring to lift her eyes. Rachel glanced at me briefly, her gaze filled with confusion, but quickly dropped it when Luke cleared his throat. And Thomas, my husband, the one I expected would say something, do something, just shook his head slightly and whispered, "Don't make a big deal out of it. It's my family's tradition." No defense, no sign of anger toward his father. Just submission, as if I were the fool for not understanding that tradition. On the outside, I kept a calm face, my lips tightly pressed to hold back a scream. But inside, everything boiled. I was hurt that my whole day's effort was treated like nothing. Insulted that I was treated like a servant in my own home. And furious that Thomas, the man I call my husband, stood there and let me be humiliated without uttering a word. I looked around the dinner table, saw John chewing the chicken I made with smug satisfaction, saw Luke laughing loudly at his own joke, saw Susan and Rachel shrinking in silence, and I asked myself, is this family? Is this where I belong? I didn't stand up. I didn't fight back yet. But in my mind, a plan was beginning to form. If they want to play the tradition game, I'll show them my tradition. After that humiliating night, I couldn't sleep. The anger simmered inside me like a slow burning fire, not explosive, but hot enough to incinerate every last bit of submission I had left. I was no longer the naive girl who would bow her head for the sake of peace. I decided I would no longer allow the men in this house to trample on my self-respect. The next morning, while Thomas was still groggy with his coffee, I picked up my phone and sent a message to the family group chat. This Sunday, I'd like to invite everyone over for dinner. I'll be cooking a feast. He looked up surprised. Another dinner? Aren't you tired? I gave a soft smile, but inside I was cold. No, darling. I want everyone to see how much I appreciate your family. He nodded, suspecting nothing, while I had already begun planning a strike they'd never forget. I threw myself into preparations like a warrior heading into battle. I didn't cook the usual dishes anymore. No roast chicken, no simple mashed potatoes. This time, I chose luxury. Dishes so lavish that even John, with his boastful mouth, would have to shut it. I went to the market early, picked out the finest cuts of prime ribs, fat, juicy shrimp, vibrant green asparagus, and kneaded dough with my own hands to bake sourdough bread. I spent hours in the kitchen, roasting ribs with garlic and butter until the aroma filled the air, boiling potatoes and whipping them smooth with rich cream, and plating everything with precision like a professional chef. I transformed the dining table into a work of art with white silk napkins, tall glowing candles, and immaculate porcelain plates arranged perfectly. I wanted them to step in and immediately sense that this was not just another dinner. This was my declaration. Sunday arrived, and everyone showed up on time. John walked in, nose in the air as he sniffed the aroma, laughing loudly. Pulling out all the stops today, daughter-in-law. Luke clapped Thomas on the back. You've trained your wife well. Susan quietly took her seat, and Rachel gave me a slight smile, her eyes seeming to want to say something, but she didn't dare. I invited them to sit down, bringing out each dish with a calm smile. John, Luke, and Thomas sat at the head of the table as usual, already holding their forks, ready to dig in. Just as they were about to stab into the ribs, I acted. I stood up, walked over, and in a flash, snatched John's plate first, then Luke's, then Thomas's. All three froze, forks suspended in midair. I calmly handed the plates to Susan and Rachel and kept one for myself, speaking each word clearly. Tonight, the women eat first. That's the new tradition. The room turned to ice. John's eyes bulged, his jaw clenched so tightly I could hear his teeth grinding. Luke gave a dry laugh, but it faltered when he realized I wasn't joking. What kind of stunt is this? Thomas looked at me, voice trembling. What? What are you doing? I picked up my fork, speared a shrimp, brought it to my mouth, chewed slowly, and replied, I'm just doing what this family usually does. It's tradition, remember? John slammed his hand on the table and stood up. You don't do this to my family. I looked up, straight into his eyes, and said coldly, But this is my house, Dad. And I decide how it's run. Luke growled, Ridiculous. Who do you think you are? I turned to him, offering a faint smile. I'm the one who cooked this meal. If you don't like it, the door is right there. Susan, for the first time in the 3 years I'd known her, picked up her fork. Her hands were shaking, but she stabbed a piece of rib and ate it slowly, as if trying to reclaim a piece of long-lost freedom. Rachel looked at me, then at her own plate, and also began eating, gently, but I saw a spark in her eyes, as if she'd just found a glimmer of light in the darkness. John and Luke sat there, faces flushed red, their hands empty, while Thomas bowed his head, unsure of what to do. I finished my last bite, wiped my mouth, then stood up. Women cook, men clean. That's also a new tradition. Get started. John's jaw dropped. Luke let out a laugh of disbelief, but when he saw I wasn't moving, he fell silent. Thomas sighed, stood up, and quietly began clearing the dishes into the kitchen. And for the first time, I saw him do something without waiting for his father's command. The atmosphere in the room had completely changed. Whispers began to rise. Susan softly said to Rachel, "This is really delicious." Rachel nodded, looking at me with gratitude. John and Luke still sat motionless, but I knew they felt it. The power was no longer in their hands. I stood there, looking at the whole family, filled with a sense of autonomy I hadn't felt in 3 years. They had underestimated me, thought I would always bow before their so-called tradition. But that night, I didn't just reclaim my plate, I reclaimed myself. And when they left, John's eyes no longer held arrogance, but caution. I knew this wasn't the end. The real battle was just beginning, and I was ready for whatever came next, not just for me, but for every woman in this family. That night, when it was just Thomas and me in the kitchen, he didn't say much. He just sat there, glass of water in hand, eyes fixed on the table. I knew what he was thinking, torn between me and his family, between what he had always believed to be right and what I had just shown him was wrong. But I didn't care anymore. That dinner wasn't just an act of revenge. It was a statement that I would not live like Susan, would not accept the fate Rachel had once endured. I had planted a seed, and I could feel it growing, not just within me, but within the other women at that table. John might have thought he won by walking out, but he had no idea he had just ignited a much larger war, one I had no intention of stopping. And I would bring others with me. Next week, I would call Rachel, talk to Susan, and show them that we no longer have to wait for our turn. The night after that explosive dinner, my kitchen felt colder than ever, as if the laughter from earlier had never happened. I leaned against the counter, arms folded, watching Thomas sitting across from me, his eyes lost in the storm of emotions I had just stirred. The pile of dishes remained in the sink, untouched, like a reminder that everything had changed. Thomas finally broke the silence, his voice low but sharp. "You really made everyone uncomfortable, you know? Did you even think about how I felt? About how my father felt?" That sentence was the final drop that made the glass overflow, but I didn't explode. I took a deep breath to cool the rage and replied, "And what about me, Thomas? Did you ever think about how I felt when your father took my plate, when you sat there and let me be treated like an outsider in my own home?" He opened his mouth to respond, but I raised my hand to stop him. I didn't want to hear another excuse. That confrontation was inevitable. I stepped closer to him, my voice shaking with emotion but firm as stone. "You know, I'm not a woman who exists to serve anyone. I didn't marry you to be belittled, to live in the shadow of your father or the tradition you keep defending. I am your wife, your partner, not your servant." Thomas looked up, his eyes red, but I could see it wasn't just anger in them. There was confusion too, like he was staring at a version of me he'd never met. He sighed, rubbing his forehead. "You're right, you're not. But I grew up with my parents like that. It's what I know. I don't know what to do when you turn your back on my whole family." His words pierced me, not because they hurt, but because I realized how deeply his family had bound him. "Thomas," I said, my voice softening but not weakening, "if you can't stand up for me for us, then this marriage doesn't mean anything anymore." In that moment, I saw Thomas change, but not in the way I had hoped. He stood up, walked out of the kitchen, and I heard him mutter, "I need to think." For the next few days, he became distant. He started talking more about his family, but not to apologize or make things right. He defended them, though weakly. "My dad's just doing what he knows. Don't be too harsh." I looked at him, heart heavy, because I saw that he was clinging to the past, trying to preserve the image of the father he once idolized. But the way he avoided my eyes, the silence whenever I mentioned that dinner, told me he was torn. He wanted to be a good husband, but he couldn't let go of the invisible leash John had wrapped around him since childhood. And I couldn't keep living with a man who chose his family over me, over us. A few days later, Rachel called me. Her voice trembled through the phone. "I need to talk to you." I told her to come right over, and when she arrived, I saw her eyes were red, her hand clutching the hem of her shirt like she was afraid it would slip away. "You made me think a lot after that night," she said, her voice cracking. "I don't want to live like this anymore with Luke, with his family." I sat her down and listened as she told me about the nights Luke yelled at her for asking about money, how he controlled every outfit she wore, every person she saw. When you did what you did at dinner, I saw how furious Luke got. Not because he thought it was unfair, but because he couldn't stand losing control. I'm scared that if I stay, I'll become like Mother Susan. I held her hand, my heart aching but swelling with pride. Rachel, you don't have to endure this. You deserve a life of your own. Rachel's story hit me like a bucket of cold water straight to the face, waking me from the illusions I once clung to. I sat there, listening to her talk about the nights Luke yelled at her, about how he controlled every dress she wore, every meal she cooked, every person she met, and I saw myself in her, a version of me I could become if I stayed with Thomas. I once dreamed of a home filled with laughter, warm dinners with Thomas, cozy nights by the fireplace telling each other stories of our day. But now, looking around the cold, silent house, I realized that dream had shattered the night John snatched my plate and Thomas shook his head with indifference. Maybe Thomas was changing. I saw it in his eyes when he tried to explain, tried to hold on. But his change was too slow, like a rusted train trying to drag itself across a desert. I no longer had the patience to wait. I no longer wanted to place my hope in a fragile miracle that might never come. I began thinking about a way out, not just for myself, but for Rachel, trembling before me, and maybe even for Susan, the quiet mother-in-law I believe still held some yearning for freedom deep inside her. That night, after Thomas had fallen asleep, I quietly went to the living room, sat beneath the soft glow of a yellow lamp, and wrote a short letter with pen in hand. Thomas, I'm not angry at you for being your father's son, but I can't keep living with someone who won't choose me over his family. I need to go, and you need time to figure out what you really want in life. Every word felt like a cut to my heart, but also like a cut to set me free. I placed the letter on the dining table where he would see it in the morning, then picked up my phone and called Rachel. I'll help you if you want to leave Luke, I said, my voice steady even as my heart grew heavy. On the other end, she whispered, I do. I really do. I smiled, though my eyes burned with tears, because I knew this wasn't just the end of my marriage with Thomas. It was the first spark of a greater uprising. John may have thought he won when he silenced me at that dinner, but he never imagined that very act had awakened a flame in me that would not be extinguished. I would not leave alone. I would take with me the other women in this family, those who had been suppressed for far too long, and we would rise together, stronger than any tradition they had ever worshipped. I told myself, next week, I'll meet with Rachel, help her plan her next steps, and maybe even knock on Susan's door and show her that she, too, deserves a different life. This battle was just beginning. Everything took an unexpected turn just 2 days after I left that letter behind. Rachel showed up at my doorstep, dragging a tiny suitcase, eyes red from crying, but blazing with a determination I had never seen in her before. I filed for divorce, she said, voice trembling but solid like stone. Luke screamed at me, called me a traitor, smashed his favorite wine glass, but I don't care anymore. You showed me I don't have to endure one more second. I pulled her into my arms and held her tightly, a mix of pride and pain swelling in my chest. I knew the path she chose would be hard. Luke wouldn't let go easily. His family would turn against her. But the way she stood upright, no longer cowering like a caged bird, made me believe she'd make it through. The seed I planted that night, the night I took back my plate and declared that women eat first, had sprouted. Not just in me, but in Rachel too. She sat down on the sofa, her hands still gripping the hem of her shirt, and told me about the night she left. I looked at him, and for the first time, I thought, I don't need him to survive. Her words were like a gust of wind that fanned the flame inside me. And I knew then, this wasn't just one person's story. It was the beginning of something much bigger. I looked at Rachel and saw her as a mirror reflecting everything I had been through, and I told myself I wouldn't let her face it alone. I made her a cup of tea and sat beside her through the night, listening as she recounted the years Luke had controlled her, how many times she wanted to leave but didn't dare, and the moment she finally decided to walk out that door. You know, she said, eyes staring off into the distance. When you stood up at dinner, I thought, if she can do it, why can't I? I held her hand and whispered, you can, and I'll be right here with you. That night, as she drifted to sleep on my sofa, I stood by the window, watching the dim moonlight spill onto the quiet street, my heart filled with a strange mix of sadness for what I had lost with Thomas, and excitement for what Rachel and I were about to build. I knew Thomas would see the letter the next morning, that he would call, that he would try to pull me back. But I had made up my mind. I wasn't just leaving him. I was paving a path toward a new life. Not just for me, but for women like Rachel, like Susan, who had been trapped in this family for far too long. This wasn't an ending. It was the beginning of a small revolution, and I would lead it step by step, with every ounce of strength I had found at 30. I didn't stop with Rachel. 1 week later, I drove to Susan's house unannounced, driven by an intense instinct that she too was trapped in a cage of her own, just like Rachel and I had once been. My old car rolled through the quiet suburban streets, my heart both anxious and resolute, as though I were seeking the final piece to complete the picture of freedom I had started painting. When I arrived, I knocked, and Susan opened the door, looking frail in a loose gray sweater. Her eyes were sunken and red, as if she had cried all night, but the look in her eyes wasn't lifeless like before. "I know why you're here," she said right away, her voice small, but no longer trembling or weak like it had been when I'd seen her at John's house. "Rachel told me everything, and I can't take it anymore." I said nothing, simply pulled her inside and sat down on the old couch in the living room, where the faint scent of stale coffee lingered from a forgotten cup on the table. The room was silent, save for the ticking of the wall clock, like the heartbeat of someone waiting to be freed. Susan began to speak, hesitant at first, but gradually more certain, as though she were shedding the layers of armor she had worn for years. She told me about her early days with John, a man she had once loved for his strength, only to realize it wasn't strength at all, but control. "There was a time I wanted to leave," she said, eyes gazing out the window where raindrops streamed down the glass. "When Thomas was little, I packed my bags. But I got scared. Scared he'd find me. Scared I couldn't raise my son alone." She paused, took a deep breath, and continued. "I watched Thomas grow up, saw him slowly become John, the way he talked, the way he thought, and I couldn't stop it. I just stayed quiet. I sat there, listening, feeling a mix of sorrow and anger, not toward her, but toward the family that had smothered her for decades. "You remind me of who I used to be," she said, her eyes glistening with tears, lit by a spark of hope I had never seen in her before. "I used to dream of being a painter, you know? I loved painting fields and rivers. But John told me women didn't need dreams. They only needed to care for their husbands and children." Her words felt like a knife to my heart, because I understood the pain of having your dreams stolen, of being forced into a mold that wasn't yours. I held her hand, her bony fingers trembling in mine, and said, "You can still dream, Susan. It's not too late. You deserve that." She looked at me, lips pressed tightly as if holding back tears, then nodded softly, like it was the first time she believed she had the right to live for herself. The next day, my phone rang, and Susan's voice came through the speaker, shaky but filled with conviction. "I'm leaving. I'm going to live with my sister in Boise. Please don't tell John, okay?" I smiled, warmth blooming in my chest. "I won't, Susan. Just go and live well." She hung up, and I stood there, looking out the window, imagining her stepping onto a bus with a small suitcase, free for the first time in years. But the true ending, the one that will stay with me forever, came when I faced Thomas for the last time. It was a rainy afternoon, the sky dark and heavy, mirroring the gloom that had settled over my heart in recent days. I had just moved into a small apartment in the suburbs, a modest place with white walls and a large window overlooking a tree-lined street. The rain tapped rhythmically on the roof when I heard urgent knocking at the door. I opened it, and there stood Thomas, soaked through, his coat clinging to him, his hair messy and dripping, his eyes sunken like a man who hadn't slept in days. "I don't want to lose you," he said, his voice hoarse and trembling with emotion. "I told my father I'm not listening to him anymore. I fought with him. I told him I'd choose you. I want us to start over, can we?" His words blew through me like a storm wind, carrying both hope and heartache, twisting my insides with painful longing. I looked at him, the man I once loved so deeply, once dreamed of building a happy family with, and my heart felt crushed. I wanted to believe him, to take his hand and say that everything would be okay, that we could wipe the slate clean and begin again. But then the memory returned, his silent nod at that first dinner, a scar that never faded. I remembered his eyes when John grabbed my plate, the way he whispered, "Don't make a scene," as if I was the one causing trouble. I remembered all the times he chose silence instead of standing up for me. "Thomas," I said, my voice calm but firm, each word carved from stone. "You didn't lose me because of your father. You lost me because you didn't choose me when I needed you most." "Start over?" "I already did, but not with you." He stood there, rain pouring down his pale face, eyes wide with disbelief. I took a deep breath and closed the door without looking back. I didn't keep the old house, didn't cling to memories with Thomas. I started fresh in my little apartment, where I hung the paintings I had created, planted a pot of green by the window, and each night I cooked for myself, not to serve anyone, but to savor it. One morning, Rachel came by with a handmade bouquet, and we sat laughing over coffee. She said, "You know, I never thought I could live like this, free." I nodded. "Me neither." From the ashes of that marriage, I didn't just rise, I was reborn, stronger than before, and no one, not John, not Thomas, not anyone, could take that from me. But the most striking ending wasn't my departure or the small victories of Rachel and Susan. It came when I received a letter from Carol, Susan's sister, someone I had never met. In the letter, she wrote, "Susan told me about you, the woman who changed that whole family. I used to live like her, but I've left you now. Thank you, even though you don't know me." I folded the letter, gazing out the window where sunlight filtered through the leaves of my little plant, and I smiled. My actions hadn't just broken my own chains. They rippled outward like a stone cast into water, reaching people I'd never known. I didn't just walk away from Thomas. I burned down the tradition they worshipped. And from that fire, other women found their own light. At 30, I didn't just reclaim myself. I became a lighthouse for those who once thought escape was impossible.